Welcome, AP Statistics. This is going to be the last section of Chapter 11, and we're going to be talking all about surveys. Now that we've discussed sampling for the first 3 lessons, we're going to talk about good and bad surveys, mostly bad surveys. So this is the slide about a good survey, all right? We call a good survey valid. That is the technical term. So a survey is valid when it yields the information that we are seeking about the population we are interested in. A valid survey has the goal of answering specific questions of a specific population. These are not broad up to interpretation questions of just anyone who's willing to take our survey. Specific questions of a specific population. It chooses the most suitable sampling frame. Ideally, our sampling frame, which if you recall, is the set of possible subjects we could sample from. We got a big old list of everyone we sample from, assign everyone a random number. Ideally, that sampling frame contains everyone in the population. Asks the right questions. That's not to say that the only questions the survey asks are related. You might want to throw in some questions for a little red herring, just to make your intentions not entirely obvious. If you make your intentions too obvious, people might catch on what you're trying to survey about, what you're trying to learn about. But if you keep your intentions hidden, people might be a bit more honest in their responses. But a long survey is demotivating. It's not fun. So don't go too far off the beaten path and ask all the right questions. Ask specific questions. An example of a non-specific question is, how much sleep do you normally get? Well, there are many ways to answer that. You could refer to how much sleep do you get when life is normal, how much sleep have you gotten in the past week, how much good sleep as opposed to interrupted sleep have you gotten. There are many ways to answer that question. Here's a better question. How much sleep did you get last night? Okay, that really narrows it down. You know how much sleep you got last night. I know how much sleep I got last night. Okay? So that is a specific question, and it's quantifiable. To that point, we want to ask quantitative questions when possible. If we have a question about the quality of sleep that we had, that might be useful, but it's harder to make a graph of information, or we're more restricted in how we graph and analyze the graph of qualitative data. We want to stick to quantitative where possible. There are more tools of analysis and statistics for quantitative data. And we avoid phrasing that could skew responses. The first one is one that I actually got before. Will you support the president in an upcoming election? So this is a couple of elections ago. I was walking through town one time, and someone who was politically minded came up to me with pamphlets in hand saying, will you support the president in the upcoming election? Now, that's a question that you feel awkward answering, because if I were to say no, that just sounds kind of unpatriotic. Why wouldn't I support the leader of the country? It sounds kind of weird to say. So will you support the president in the upcoming election? That's a question that could skew a response. Also, you could have a survey that has an answer like, yes, because our future depends on it. Well, if you don't answer yes, if you answer no, it's kind of like you're saying the future doesn't matter, which is, that's just kind of nasty. So these sorts of questions and answers guilt you into responses, and that makes people consider leaving information that's not true. So we don't want bad questions and bad answers that guilt you into answering one or the other way. So to test the quality of a survey, sometimes we send out a pilot survey ahead of the actual survey so bugs can be fixed. If you ever watched a TV show, there's a pilot episode. There's one episode that goes out. We can see how the show is doing, test to see if the audience likes certain parts of the show and not others, whether the show has potential or not. Same happens with surveys. You send out a pilot survey ahead of the actual survey so that we can fix some of the bugs, and just like a TV series, make the actual survey appeal to our desired audience. So now we're going to talk about every way in which a survey can go wrong. This is the fun part of the lesson. There are many ways that bias can creep into surveys and distort results. Now, mind you, when we talk about bias in surveys, at first glance you might think, oh, people intentionally make biased surveys, and that's not false. But it's not that people intentionally put bias in surveys and we just need to root it out and be good statisticians. It's that if we are not careful, bias naturally happens. And we need to be super duper careful to, as much as possible, eliminate bias from our research. Bias will naturally happen unless we fight back. And the rest of this lesson is all the ways in which bias can happen. And once we know the ways in which bias can happen, we have the tools to fight back. So, a few common sources of bias are voluntary response surveys, using an incomplete sampling frame, convenience sampling, undercoverage, and additionally, we can have responses to survey questions that reveal other forms of bias, namely response bias and non-response bias, which awkwardly is not the opposite of response bias. More on that later. Let's talk about voluntary response surveys featuring Calvin, and I think that's Susie from Calvin and Hobbes. In a voluntary response survey, a large group of individuals is invited to respond, and those who choose to take the survey are the only ones who are counted. This is problematic because the respondents determine the sample rather than the researcher. Uh-oh. If you're a researcher, you want to choose people at random. That's a way of avoiding bias. Randomness is our friend in statistics. Voluntary response survey, that's not random. The people who take the survey choose themselves. The result is a high potential for voluntary response bias. People with strong opinions will be more likely to take this kind of survey, and negative opinions, tend to outweigh the positive ones, right? People like to gripe about things. And so if you put out a voluntary response survey, people with strong, usually negative opinions will rise to the top. I was actually in a meeting with someone who thought about putting out a survey to the general public about an issue, and I actually advised this individual not to do that. And I said, here's what's going on. You're going to get a lot of negative opinions, and it's not going to be very helpful in understanding the population you want to learn about. So I actually talked someone out of doing a voluntary response survey, and it was because I had a knowledge of statistics, and now you have that knowledge too. Let's look at an example of voluntary response. You're trying to find out what freshmen think of food served on campus and have thought of a variety of sampling methods, all time-consuming. A friend suggests you set up a Tell Us What You Think website and invite freshmen to visit the site to complete a questionnaire. That's a horrible idea. What is wrong with this idea? There are so many things wrong with this idea, but what's wrong with this idea as it relates to sampling is letting each freshman decide whether to participate makes this a voluntary response survey. We've seen that's not good. Students who were dissatisfied might be more likely to go on the website and record their complaints, and this could give me a biased view of the opinions of all freshmen. If you don't care about the food, you might not respond to this survey. You might X out and continue on with whatever you were doing. But if you have strong opinions about the food served on campus, if you're really not a fan of the taco salad, if you're not sure what the meat was in the taco salad, then you're going to gripe. All right, you're going to say, taco salad was terrible. No offense to taco salad, I enjoy it thoroughly, but if you mess up taco salad, you might hear about it in this survey. The people who don't care might not respond. That means that you only get the opinions of strongly opinionated people with bad things to say. Perhaps I could have said that better. Anyway, convenience sampling. Convenience sampling is just that. It's sampling whoever is most convenient to study. And a convenience sample is usually not representative of the population. If you're choosing a sample for the sake of convenience, it's not a sample that's made to serve the purposes of statistics. Kind of like how junk food is not designed to be nutritious, it's designed to be tasty. Convenience samples are designed to be convenient. They're not designed to do good statistics. So what happens is if you're focused on something other than doing good statistics, here comes bias. So consider the result of a survey about home computers from Orange County, California in 2001, before home computers were commonplace. The report says, and this is from our textbook, all but 2% of buyers have at least one computer at home, and 62% have two or more. Of those with a computer, 99% are connected to the internet. And you got your source. So that's really cool. A lot of people had computers in Orange County, California before computers were commonplace otherwise. What's the problem? Well, this survey was taken on the internet. Oof. That's really bad statistics. If the survey was taken on the internet, do you think people went to their public library to use the computer to take a survey on using computers at your house? I don't think so. I think the people who took this survey had a computer at their house, and the people who didn't take the survey didn't have a computer at their house. So that's why almost everyone who took this survey said they had a computer, because they were doing it on their computer. My. Here's an insightful note about internet surveys. Feel free to pause the video and read this. Hopefully this will enlighten you. Moving on. Using an incomplete sampling frame. All right? Really, the title says it all. If the sampling frame is who you can sample from and it's incomplete, well, that's going to be a problem. Though challenging, a sampling frame should consist of all relevant subjects, not just the ones that are convenient to find. Everyone you want to learn about should be in the sampling frame. So for example, a sampling frame for U.S. citizens may be lacking the homeless, hard to reach them. Prisoners, hard to reach them. People who travel often, frequent flyers, hard to reach them. So if your sampling frame does not include certain parts of the population, you're not going to learn about everyone in the population. If you want to study all U.S. citizens, then you are going to need some of these folks in your sampling frame. And though it's tough to do, you should have them there. Otherwise, your survey will produce biased results. Undercoverage. All right, this is very closely related to what we just talked about. A survey design is said to suffer from undercoverage when a portion of the population has a proportionally smaller or non-existent representation in the sample than it does in the population, hence undercovered. For example, surveys that have callers call homes at dinner time, when lots of folks are home, will miss people who eat out a lot. Kind of like how sampling frames often miss people who travel a lot. Here, people who eat out often are less likely to be surveyed. They make up a portion of the population, but they'll be proportionally less represented in this survey because the phone survey happens at dinner time. The subsets of the population left out of the sampling frame, homeless, prisoners, frequent flyers, etc., are chronically undercovered. You may be able to get a few of them, but you won't get as much without a lot of effort as the proportion of their population would have us ideally find. Now we're on to response bias. This is where we start talking about how people can offer responses in surveys that are not helpful. Response bias is the tendency of a person to answer questions on a survey in a manner that's misleading or simply false. You may be thinking to yourself, wait, this isn't the researcher's fault. This is the respondent's fault. Okay, fine. But you're the one that goes in with the knowledge of statistics. Can you write questions that can completely avoid response bias? Can you completely avoid the possibility that if you have a bubble sheet for people to fill out, that people will just bubble in some Christmas trees and call it a day? No. But you can limit response bias by asking good questions to a specific population. So, examples of response biases include the tendency for respondents to tailor their responses to the interviewer, right? So you're being interviewed and you want to look good in front of the person who is interviewing you. So you doctor some things you would say, and maybe it's not entirely honest. Maybe it's not truly how you feel. For example, if an FCA student were given a survey question that read, how do you feel about the dress code? For those of you who are not FCA students watching, we do have a dress code here. We're a private Christian school. Students may respond differently if their responses will be read by a student council as opposed to a panel of teachers. Maybe if you have this survey sent out by student council, the responses will be humorous, sarcastic, maybe a little satirical, I don't know. But in front of a panel of teachers, you may respond differently. If you want to show respect, you'll hinder your responses. If you really want to let the teachers hear it, you'll vent all your negative opinions. People are going to respond differently depending on who they're responding to. Unwillingness of respondents to reveal info they feel is personal. For example, if FCA students were given a survey question that read, how many times have you been written up for dress code violations? Well, a student might not want to answer honestly because they think discipline is a personal matter. And I would agree with them. So that's a dangerous question to ask. How many times have you been written up for a dress code violation? You're going to get all sorts of incorrect answers. Unwillingness of respondents to reveal unpopular views or illegal behavior. We want to keep those things to ourselves, right? So, for example, if FCA students were given a survey question that read, how many times have you been out of dress code this week? Students might not answer honestly because that could be considered a confession. So sometimes I'll see surveys that ask, have you ever, or did you ever, or something like that. And it's about something that's not legal. And I just think to myself, why on earth would I check yes? Why would I do that? Now we're on to non-response bias, which is not the opposite of response bias. Non-response bias is the tendency for the opinions of non-respondents to differ from the opinions of respondents, and thus their absence in a study skews the results. For example, if an FCA student were given a survey question that read, how do you feel about the dress code? Students who don't really care about the dress code, they just kind of put up with it, or maybe they're rather fond of it, they do exist out there, I think, might not respond at the rate of students with strong opinions. This is kind of like voluntary response bias, except even if we do a good study, this kind of thing might happen. For this reason, a large survey might not yield the same quality results as a small survey with a high response rate. So we want to try to get as many people as possible to respond to our survey, and one way of doing that is awarding people with money if they respond. My family has actually taken several surveys offered in the Lehigh Valley over the years where we live, and we've gotten a little bit of money from doing that. They have a good incentive. You fill out the survey, you send it in, cha-ching, you got your money. So that's one way of doing it. You want that high response rate. So rather than sending a survey to a whole town, commit to following up with a smaller sample of the town, and that will limit non-response bias. Okay, so if you make sure that everyone you are pursuing for their opinions on things responds, that will limit non-response bias. You don't want people throwing the survey in the trash. And that's tough to avoid. That's really tough. This might be the hardest one to avoid. But it is possible. You just need to be very persistent and be willing to shell out a little money, perhaps. Now, this is different than undercoverage. This is easily confused with undercoverage, and here's the big difference. Undercoverage. Some people aren't going to be surveyed at all. Portions of the population can be undercovered if they're just exceptionally hard to reach. So they're, say, folks who are frequent flyers make up, I don't know, say the top 5% of most frequent flyers, all right? Less than 5% of that group is going to, less than 5% of the sample is going to be that group of people, just because they're out of the country so much, they're so hard to reach, all right? So undercoverage is when some people just won't be surveyed at all, okay? Non-response bias is that some people will get the survey, but they choose not to respond. So for parts of the population that are undercovered, they don't even get the survey. Non-response bias, they get the survey, but they choose not to respond. And people who choose not to respond may have different opinions than people who do choose to respond. So it can mess up the results. And here's the hard truth about survey bias. Unfortunately, there is no way to recover from a biased sampling method. That's rough. However, there are ways to mitigate against bias. One, we could report sampling methods thoroughly and share them with stat-savvy individuals who can point out potential pitfalls. We're essentially reaching out for help. And consider whether some subjects in the population could have been excluded from the study. And finally, pilot test a study to check for ways to improve. And do your stats homework. There you go. Have a great day.